Welcome to the second session of today's conference. Before I turn this session over to the new chair for this part of the afternoon, I had a request from some of the people who are just entering the conference now to have a summary of, not a summary, I will not attempt a summary of what went on this morning, but I just want to gesture toward a couple of the continuing threads of conversation, since I did, and then we're going to start with some continuation of that conversation before we introduce the new discussants into the mix this afternoon. As I said, I cannot summarize what went on, but I just want to allude to the issue that Carol Duncan raised of looking at the traversal, the cultural traveler for whom the ability to move between geographic and cultural locations is an asset rather than a liability, and is seen as a site of creativity. The comparison she made, I'm talking about you, Carol, so the comparison that you made between that image that came out of her fieldwork and her own role, and the questions that we all face as participant observers or non-participants or non-observers, or wherever it is that we fit in that mix. And then we also had quite a bit a wonderful discussion coming from the discussion of Russian poetry, where the idea was put forth that that there could be an escape from gender, but then there was a return of gendered language, and we had a lot of conversation about the gendered nature of language, which connected with some issues that Janet Gyatso raised about conceptual categories, how many genders are there in Tibetan monasticism, and how physical and religious and medical categories for categorizing human beings line up. With that very inadequate opening to bring the new participants into the conversation, I would like to turn the chair over to Karen King, the Wynne Professor of Ecclesiastical History at the Divinity School, a.k.a. the Professor of Women and Heresy.
Welcome back from lunch. We thought we might start, since we interrupted in some ways the conversation from this morning, and some people had comments if we'd like to continue that. Are there people who want to get into the conversation right now at the beginning? Comments or questions from the morning? Right. Janet's not here. Janet had a comment, but Janet's not here. Yet. She's not back from lunch yet. No? Okay, because there were so many hands up, we thought we'd want to... Yeah, I think Janet's comment so briefly about the way that the sex-gender difference, which has done so much work for feminist studies, is now really being itself problematized, is important for all of our work. Mm-hmm. Are there other? Yeah.
Well, in conversation with Janet, we were thinking also that there was an overarching, broader theoretical thing that came through all the papers that I think is very relevant to most of our work, and that's a kind of tension between the need for disciplinary order and categories, that which you find in medicine and religion, and a kind of hybridity that we find in gender studies and visual culture. And this tension is what a lot of people had in their different disciplines and their different projects. I think that would be really interesting to discuss.
Yeah, and the way that that intersects then both, women's studies, gender, sexuality issues, and religion, and the mix of the two.
Jenna had just brought up the hybridity question.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you had a comment, too, you wanted to make from this morning's session. We're sort of continuing the discussion a little bit before we get started.
I'm not sure how relevant, so
some of them can, again, be reignited.
Yeah,
later.
exactly.
There's
We
no
just didn't
reason
want
to keep our discussion only limited to our papers. We can bring those back in.
Absolutely. But what I didn't want to do was sort of close down conversation while we still had things to go. So let's move to the afternoon session, which is going to be on theory and practice. Unfortunately, as was announced this morning, Professor Amy Hollywood is not going to be able to join us because she's been attacked by the flu season, so we're wishing her health and well-being. We have two presenters this afternoon, Asani Najmabadi and Theda Scotch-Paul. Professor Najmabadi is professor of history and of the studies of women, gender, and sexuality here at Harvard. Her research and teaching interests center on socio-cultural transformations of gender and sexuality in the modern Middle East and South Asia, with particular attention to how these transformations are interarticulated with conceptualizations of modernity and secularism. One of her most recent books is titled Women with Mustaches and Men Without Beards, Gender and Sexual Anxieties of Iranian Modernity. It was published in 2005. She's currently working on two major projects. One is editorship or co-editorship of the Encyclopedia of Women in Islamic Culture, an encyclopedic work that I think we're all looking forward to be incredibly important for the field. And also her own research project right now on sexing gender, transing homos, travail of sexuality in contemporary Iran. Which I think we're going to hopefully hear a bit about. Not at all. No. Okay. But we can ask about later. Okay. So she's going to speak with us first, and then will be followed by Theda Scotch-Paul, who is the Victor S. Thomas Professor of Government and Sociology, and also, I think, known here as Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Harvard. She is a distinguished scholar, has received numerous fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, Institute for Advanced Study, so on and so forth. Her work is on comparative politics, American politics, comparative and historical sociology, U.S. history, and public policy. Perhaps one of her best-known books is the work on, let me get the title right, Protecting Soldiers and Mothers, The Political Origins of Social Policy in the United States, which won a number of scholarly awards. For the last 15 years, her work has focused on U.S. politics in historical and contemporary perspective. Her newest book, which I just saw, and she actually has a real-life copy, is What a Mighty Power We Can Be. African-American Fraternal Groups in the Struggle for Racial Equality, which she wrote with Ariane Liazos and Marshall Gantz from Princeton University Press. So we're looking forward to hearing from both of you.
Thank you. I'm actually not going to be talking about the transsexuality project, but from another project that I'm on the side working, and that is a historical work on genealogy of Iranian feminism. In part, I'm not talking that much about the transsexuality project because it has something to do we were discussing in the morning session, and that is as in totally inexperienced and unknowledgeable anthropologist, I'm not trying to figure out how can I regain a distance that I had lost with suspending disbelief without feeling devastatingly disloyal. So until I figure that out, I'm sort of stuck with the other project. But hopefully one of these days I'll figure it out. What I'm going to talk about today has more to do with the genealogy of feminism project. But I want to preface those remarks by two preliminary reflections. When I first got the blurb about this event, what struck me in the first sentence was the words encounter, clash. And I thought, how is it that in 2006, the relationship between studies of women, gender, sexuality, and feminism on the one hand, and religion and studies of religion continues to be articulated in terms of an encounter, even a clash. It reminded me of the earlier moments and debates where there was seen to be an sort of incompatibility between being a feminist and being a religious subject. In Islamic studies, as well as within the domain of gender rights activism in Muslim-majority societies, the same encounter or clash has been played out by marking feminism as Western and external to Islamic heritage, a topic that has been discussed at length, and by a state of skepticism and suspicion dominating over the relationship between Muslim, secularist, feminist, and in particular on the ground among the activists who work in or have come from these various tendencies. The surprisingly long life of these debates, encounters, suspicions, and fractures in working alliances indicate the historical legacy of secularist narratives of not only historiography of feminism and feminist movements, but also of religion itself. This brings me to a second preliminary reflection I wanted to start with, and that is the whole notion of who has religion and who has only religion, and who doesn't need to have religion, especially as it comes to discussions of feminism, women's rights, etc. Many years ago, at a sort of a similar thematic conference at Columbia University, a colleague of mine, Judith Weisenfeld, some of you probably know her work, pointed out that how is it that in studies of American women's history, it seems to be acceptable, sometimes obligatory, to bring in religion when we study Afro-American women's history. But religion does not seem to be a needed or even more a useful category of analysis otherwise. My immediate response at the time to her was, well, then there are Muslim women who are required to have religion and only religion. That is, studies of women, gender, sexuality cannot be imagined for the Islamic world as if anything but religion mattered. I'm simplifying, of course. But this overarching determination of all things by religion in the context of history of Islamic world has become especially acute since the late 1970s, the 1979 Iranian Revolution, and the rise of the Islamist movements in many countries. While initially there was a general presumption that anything Islamic could only be bad for women's rights, gender equality, and sexual subjectivities, we have now moved on to an acceptance of something named Islamic feminism. One thing that marks this emerging acceptance, however, is a general skepticism towards its viability. On the secular side of feminism, Islamic feminism is under the permanent challenge. How far could its feminism go within something perceived as limits of Islam? And from the Islamist side, it's under suspicion for its presumed foreign contamination, inauthenticity, and un-Islamic sense. To put it crudely, from one side, it could never be truly feminist. From the other side, it could never truly be Islamic. Such double skepticism is not merely a theoretical issue. In a country like Iran, it affects on a daily basis the very possibilities of building alliances on issues of gender and sexual rights. It has rendered such alliances extremely fragile, and that's what I'm interested in. Why is it so fragile? My purpose here is not to engage with truthfulness of these visions, to prove that Islamic feminism is authentically feminist or Islamic or whatever. Rather, I want to bring out the work of gender in constitution of this divide between secularism and Islam that underwrites this continued challenge. I will do this by focusing on one country, Iran, not only because that is where I know my history, but also, while I suspect some of my arguments would be relevant to other places, I believe one of the problems with current discussions of Islam and feminism is ahistorical generalizations. These generalizations screen away vast historical and contemporary differences among countries as diverse as Algeria, Turkey, Afghanistan, and Indonesia, to name just a few. My argument assumes a historically contingent configuration of politics of modernity. what may or may not be generalizable cannot be known from what is assumed to be Islamic, modern, feminist, or secular by any prior definition of these terms. For instance, the recent reconfigurations of Islam, feminism, nationalism, and secularism in Iran have very much to do with the fact that an Islamic republic has been in power for the past 28 years, one that came out of a mass popular revolution. Emergence of a vocal feminist identification and activism among Iranian Muslim and Islamist women in the 1990s came as a surprise for many observers. For historians of late 19th and early 20th century, it should not have. In fact, if there were a surprise, it was the extent of similarities between these two moments. The similarities include philosophical pragmatism, that is, challenging Islamist anti-feminism with any combination of women-centered arguments, Islamic and secular, local and global, and an engaged relation between women's rights activists and government structures and power elites. Between these two moments, women's rights activism in Iran had become increasingly state-dominated, ideologically and structurally, whether in alliance with the state or in opposition to the state. How do we understand this historical trajectory? Iranian politics of modernity since mid-19th century has been marked by the emergence of a spectrum of nationalist and Islamist discourses. Within that spectrum, one notion of Iranian modernity took Europe as its model and increasingly combined that urge with recovery of pre-Islamic Iranianism. Other trends sought to combine their nationalism and the urge to catch up with Europe with Islam by projecting Shiism as Iranianization of Islam in its early centuries. I'm emphatically putting the latter in the spectrum of modernity in order to distinguish it from counter-modernist trends in this period. Later 20th century developments largely led to ejection and abandonment of what may be called an Islamist nationalist modernist trend from the complex hybridity of Iranian modernity until its reemergence in new configurations from the late 1980s. Until recently, it had become commonly accepted that Iranian politics has been a battleground since the mid-19th century between modernity and tradition, with Islam always in the latter camp. Similarly, the beginnings of Iranian feminism were not marked by a boundary setting Islam to its beyond. Islam was not viewed as inherently anti-woman. Conservative forces grounded their opposition to the reforms advocated by modernists in their interpretations of Islamic precepts. For instance, they argued that the establishment of new schools for girls was an example of abrogation of laws of God. The advocates of new girls' schools, however, also drew from the same sources to argue for female education. In other words, anti-feminist clerical voices were not allowed to hold a monopoly of Islamic authority or truth. The common issues of women's activism in this early period was first and foremost that of women's education, and next, the reform of marriage and divorce laws. Though in an earlier period and in the writings of a number of modernists, women's veil had become a critical marker of difference between Europe and Islamic Iran, the contention over women's veil was not simply between modernists and counter-modernists. Not all reform-minded Iranians advocated unveiling. Some actively opposed it, although they fully supported women's education and social participation. Among the latter were important groups of women. If in this earlier period a diversity of women's rights discourses and practices existed among activists, how did the conflation of modernist with non-Islamic and Islamic with tradition and anti-modern come about? A critical period for transformation of these diversities into opposing categories was the reign of Reza Shah Pahlavi, 1925 to 41. One of the major issues with which Reza Shah's reign has been marked in Iranian historical memory is unveiling of women, both for those who supported the measure and those who fought it. In its simplest form, the common narrative is that as part of his modernization measures, Reza Shah in 1936 ordered women's unveiling. There are several problems with this account. For one thing, it ignores an actual shift in Reza Shah's policy on this issue. As late as fall 1932, the government opposed replacing the chador with any other full-length outfit, as advocated and practiced by a growing number of urban middle-class women. 3 years later, in January 1936, the official unveiling decree was issued. Moreover, such accounts ignore that by the 1920s, women's unveiling had become a societal debate and actual struggle, engaged in not only by male politicians, but by some urban women themselves. Even though unveiling had not been on the agenda of reformers during the early years of the 20th century, a changing social context had begun to bring the issue to the fore. Women began to be more visible part of the social scene. Urban middle and upper class women began to slowly challenge and expand their restrictive gender spaces. Space much more restricted than that of lower middle class and working women who had a claim to streets and moving around the city. Such public presence was a contested one. Groups of women or the city police would regulate women's participation in mosques, the bazaar, and streets. On occasion, they would close the doors of the mosque and other holy places to them and prevent them from leaving the gated cities. The city officials would set rules to prevent mingling of men and women. For instance, they would limit the hours when women were allowed in these spaces. They instituted opposite sidewalks as men's and women's to keep them apart. And as women became more comfortable on the streets, they began to modify their outdoor outfits. Customary leg wears gave way to socks, colorful shoes began to make their appearances, chadors were made shorter, face veils made skimpier and easier to push aside, sometimes flirtatiously. By the end of 1920s, in certain neighborhoods, women had begun to go out on the street without face veil. Some women began to venture out without the chador, replacing it with loose, long tunics. There was also another arena in which the issue of the veil was being challenged. Urban women's activities and socializing was bringing women of different religious communities into closer interaction. Non-Muslim and Muslim women worked together in pro-reform activities, such as fundraising for girls' schools. Though non-Muslim women abided by public veiling on streets, in their private interactions, they generally did not observe veiling. In particular, Baha'i women, many embedded within Muslim kin networks, began to be encouraged to socialize with men and go without the face veil. Some of the earliest public ventures of women into the veil debate unfolded in the pages of women's press. Proponents of unveiling argued for its necessity to open up venues for women's education and professional work. Opponents argued that women's best occupation was good mothering and managing the household for their husbands. Men, in particular, seemed to be threatened by the prospect of women taking away their much-cherished civil servant occupations. Supporters, especially women writers, argued that women were being wasted at home and the country's prosperity would be impossible without their participation. Other women, however, took different positions. The disagreements were not lined up with pro-education, pro-employment, anti-veil women on the one side and the opposite position on the other. A number of women and some men argued that women's education and employment was perfectly consistent with observation of the veil. This position had its own genealogy in the writings of the earlier period, as I have indicated. Yet the weight of subsequent developments and its effect on the historiography of the Pahlavi era have made all anti-unveiling unveilers, so to speak, into opponents of women's progress and virtually eliminated this voice from Iranian history. Moreover, some women activists argued that the focus on unveiling and employment was the wrong focus. In particular, they argued for working on reform of marriage laws and practices as the precondition for any meaningful change in women's status and life. The current oppositional story, combining its emphasis on Reza Shah's violence in implementing unveiling with his repressive policy of closing down all independent parties, journals, organizations, including women's press and association, ignores that more than coercion was at work. Women's rights activists themselves were divided, both on the issue of unveiling and on how to relate to the increasing centralized autocratic government of Reza Shah. For instance, at the Second Congress of Women of the East, held in Tehran in fall 1932, while many Iranian women rights activists used the occasion of the Congress as a platform from which to address the Iranian government critically and raise their demands, others were more concerned about displaying achievements of Reza Shah's government, expressing their thankful praises to him. When there were disagreements among them, a government representative would intervene to weigh the argument along governmental policy. While the government's presence at this Congress failed to stop Iranian women activists from speaking for unveiling or other policies when it was not yet government policy, it succeeded in bringing a wing of the movement under governmental mantle. Is it possible that the change of governmental policy between 1932 and 1936 on the issue of unveiling, for instance, was in part a bargain that these women had struck? The current dissidentist historiography not only credits or blames Reza Shah with the unveiling campaign, it often considers women who began to work with his government, such as Masture Afshar, Hajar Tarbiyat, Sadiqe Dawlatabadi, as traitors to the cause of an independent women's movement. But a woman such as Dawlatabadi could hardly be thought of as a stooge of the government. She had been active since the late 1910s in opening schools and publishing journals. In 1923, she went to Europe to study. She represented an Iranian women's organization at the 1926 Congress of International Alliance for Women's Suffrage in Paris. Upon her return to Iran in 1927, she worked for girls' schools in Tehran. She continued to do much of the same after 1941 abdication of Reza Shah until her death in 1961. A more persuasive account would see her as informing what became government policy on women's issues while being formed by those very possibilities and limiting conditions with codename government. Not only were Iranian women's rights activists divided in the 1930s on how to relate to the increasingly autocratic government of Reza Shah on the issue of unveiling, unlike women's education and reform of laws of marriage and divorce, there was a deep division among them, as I've already pointed out. I stress this division because after the official ban on the chador in 1936, not only did state violence enter into this picture, but more critically, an unbridgeable chasm opened up among women's rights activists. Girls were withdrawn from schools and kept at home. Women teachers who did not want to unveil resigned from their jobs or were dismissed. Previously, all women who wanted modern education or reform of laws had crafted a space of common activity and solidarity. All these reforms were considered Islamically acceptable. Not so with unveiling. The government-enforced unveiling campaign now expelled some from this common site. As with other measures taken by Reza Shah's government, increasingly modernization became conflated with only that modernity in which becoming modern was disaffiliated from Islam and made to coincide with pre-Islamic Iranianism. Those who had sought to combine their quest for modernity with a reconfiguration of Islam were unmistakably marked as traditional and anti-modern, an identification that it has only in recent decade been reshaped. Women's rights activists and women organizations were critically implicated in production of these reconfigurations. In fact, feminism became a most privileged category marking Iranian secularism. Perhaps more than any other socio-political and cultural issue of contention, women's rights issues became markers of secularism of modernity. One consequence of this process has been that women's issues, as symbolized by the veiling-unveiling controversy, proved to be an issue on which it became practically impossible to build a consensus. This is a chasm that only recent developments have begun to challenge and change. There is a reemergence of conversation and cooperation between secular and Islamist women activists today in Iran. The emergence of a vocal feminist position from within the ranks of Islamist movement over the past 2 decades constitutes an important shift away from the past positioning of all Islam to the beyond of the modern, which has opened up a space for dialogue and an alliance with secular feminists, reversing this 60-year-old rift in which each treated the other as antagonist. The purpose of my historicization of secularism, nationalism, and feminism is not to evoke some golden age in which women were united and then became divided, hoping that one could reenact some new moment of unity. The work of historicization is a recognition of contingency. If the present configurations of Islam, secularism, and feminism are historically defined and in changing relationship, there is no reason not to imagine reconfiguration of these terms. While in Iran over the past decades, enormous achievements have been made in reversing these historical rifts by building working alliances, these alliances have continued to labor under the stress of this historical legacy at every step. They remain fragile and break easily. And if there were time, I could give you a lot of examples. I suggest this fragility comes from the second rift from Reza Shah's period. The consolidation of a notion of centralized modern state that excludes any meaningful civic participation, where only dissident anti-state activism is seen to be progressive and conducive to bringing about social change. In a sense, the old chasm between secular and Islamic feminists in Iran is now being reimagined as a chasm between what is named independent feminist versus collaborative feminist. This rearticulation arises from the specific post-1979 developments in which Islam and government became codified into one structure constitutionally in terms of political structures of the state as well as ideologically. Moreover, many of the feminist voices coming out of Islamic movements in the early 1990s had worked in and as supporters of the Islamic Republic in the 1980s and continue to be connected with various parts of a very complex and fractured state bureaucratic and political system. As such, from the beginning, their emerging feminist voices was under the suspicion of a state collaborativism. Given the concept of state inherited by most secular feminists who have come from a secular left critical direction, while the growing activism of Muslim women rights activists has provided multiple occasions for building alliances across the old secular Islamic divide, some of these fractures have tended to re-emerge as a division between feminists presumably independent of the state and those connected to the state. This is a critical issue that needs to be taken up head on. It is underwritten by a very particular concept of state that has proved to be corrosive of building civil society alliances and has set up implicit tests of loyalty and disloyalty that only work to the advantage of the most repressive forces inside and outside the government in present-day Iran. But I think I'm going to end here because that's a very long story and then leave it for discussion. Thank you.
I think we have time for a couple of questions specific to this paper, and then we will have the other paper, a few questions, and then we can open up to a broader general discussion. So if you have questions.
Yeah. No, it definitely was not post-Khomeini. There was a trend that continued within sort of what people have called liberal Islam and associated with the national movement around Bazargan, and it has its own genealogy, but it really remained very, very much marginalized, whereas in the sort of post-1979, and in particular after the war with Iraq ended. I mean, that whole decade of the war with Iraq, you couldn't talk about anything. It was just like everything driven by the war issue. But after it, when the sort of the reconstruction period began, it began to be able to basically reform itself as a very broad movement with various tendencies and trends in it that now are basically represented all over the place. It's not just one particular political formation. You see its repercussion throughout, whether, part of the thing is, there was the reformist period, so to speak, of Khatami's two presidencies, but it's actually a misnomer to limit the whole reform thinking and the reform agenda to those particular political moments. It's a much more diffused thing. Sorry. Leila had, I'm sorry.
Leila, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Do you mind? Yeah, Leila?
Thanks very much, Rosanna. That was totally fascinating. I have a couple of questions. One is...
Could you speak up, please?
Yeah.
I have a deaf ear.
Okay. And let me know if I'm not speaking. Is this okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Two things were striking to me. One, that the law was in 1936. Well, by then, quite a lot had happened in Egypt and Turkey.
Yeah.
And I wondered what kind of conversations there were, because these debates really happened in the early 1900s and 1910s at the latest in other places. So was there a conversation between the people in Iran and what was going on elsewhere in the Muslim world? Was this a Shia Sunni that didn't know this?
No, there were at the debate level, even in late 19th century, there were debates over veil and unveil stuff. But these never became in the earlier period the focus of women's rights activism, which was centered on education and reform of marriage law and things like that. It wasn't like I have not come across any voice, whether male or female, except for some late 19th century male writers who actually advocated as part of the reform movement in early 20th century, for instance, unveiling. People were very aware of what was happening there, especially in the pages of the women's press. It continued in 1910s and 1920s to be talked about. But it's only in the late 1910s that there are actual reports of women coming on the street lifting their face veils or changing their costumes. So in terms of actually coming into public vision in a different way and challenging it in terms of what people see on the street, it's a late 1910, and then by 1920s you have a lot more of that as actually people, like when you read there's a lot of memoirs we have from that period written by men, and when you read those memoirs, that's where you see how uncomfortable people are beginning to become, not because it's being discussed in some reform political treaties, but actually they see women who are not wearing face veils on the streets, and that produces a different set of concerns. And then by late 1920s, the issue of women's employment actually becomes linked to this, and then it becomes really a debate on women's employment. So, but I think when it really became an issue, it was actually women changing how they came on the streets.
It was just a comment. It is very striking to hear about this rapprochement or even the finding common ground between groups, feminist groups or women's groups that we think of as being, we traditionally sort of think of as secular or religious, and right and left and so on. And I'm just starting to think, in what other parts of the world do we see that happening, and how common is that? Or is there something specific about what's going on in Islamic feminism that's different? I'm just wondering.
I really don't know about other parts of the world. I think this is beginning to happen in a lot of Middle Eastern Islamic countries, and there are other people who know a lot more about it. I think there is a difference between Iran because of the revolution in 1979 and because it has been under Islamic Republic as a state form compared to places where Islamic movements are still oppositional movements, because once you're in power, you do different things in the name of Islam than you do when you're in opposition, and that matters a great deal. And a lot of Shahla is here, she knows more than I do because she's an anthropologist. I catch all these anthropologist colleagues. But, a lot of the sort of Muslim women feminists in Iran don't even call themselves Islamic feminists. They take their Islam just there. It's just there. So they call themselves feminists because that's a category that matters for them to identify, whereas calling themselves Muslim is meaningless because of course they're Muslims and stuff. I actually don't know. It's category of Islamic feminist is a much contested category, and in fact most, at least, well, in my case, all, but I don't want to say this is all the people I have talked to. They actually think this is a category of naming that has been put on them by outsiders rather than what they self-named themselves, and they don't actually like it, because it sort of puts them as a separate category of feminism, and they don't want to be, sort of boxed into that kind of a category.
And I can understand that, and that just shows how complex and actually sophisticated what's going on now is. And my comment was very much from the outside. It's just, and I'm saying, I'm calling it feminism, but that's just my personal definition. It's just, it's a wider question, and not necessarily only for you, but to think about. It's just a very, very striking thing that's happening. Just the ability to sort of recognize the sort of complexity of the veiling issue is not simply pro or anti-woman. And I'm just wondering, comparatively speaking, where we find such things in other parts of the world right now. I just think it's an interesting question for us, and whether there's something distinctive about the Islamic situation or not. I'm not sure.
Shahla, do you want to add things?
I was just going to second what you said about the activists in Iran resenting the statements. In fact, I was there last year and I gave a talk, and at some point, somebody asked me, who is a feminist, Islamic feminist? Many women, whether they are from very religious background or, shall we say, more secular or nationalist background, consider themselves feminists, and they come together and they interact. In fact, I was just there, and there was a meeting. I think you were perhaps earlier on in that meeting where women from right and left and religious and all the leaders came together and talk. So I think these categories really have to be problematized and discussed, and that's why it was such a interesting paper.
Thank you.
One last comment, and then we'll move to the next paper, and then there'll be time for others. Yeah.
Okay. I was wondering if you would be willing to expand a little bit about a question that you raised at the very beginning, namely that in the study of gender within the Islamic world, you never study it without reference to religion. How would you imagine if one were to start doing that? You study gender and not necessarily think of it in terms of, this is of course linked to the religion of Islam. How would that change the way we think about gender, study gender in those parts of the world?
Well, it's not that I don't think religion matters or Islam matters, but it's the particular way of understanding Islam and religion that has become so codified in studies of anything to do with Islamic countries, but in particular women. And that is what I would call scripturalist way of thinking. The number of studies of women in Islam that start with the Quran and verses in the Quran, it always amazes me. As if people get up in the morning and decide on anything by citing to themselves chapter 4, verse 34, But you're laughing, but just go and read what people write on Islam. That's how they write. They write with that view. So it's not a question of, and when you think about how women live their lives or how the society enacts religion in it. That's not how it works. And what's amazing is that nobody would do that. Nobody seems to be doing that for a whole number of other religious traditions. But we have such a heritage of Islamic studies coming from philological studies in 19th century into, and in that sense, it brings with it a particular trend of biblical studies from 19th century. But that's not how people do biblical studies anymore, the way they did it in 19th century. But somehow that 19th century weight has carried into the 20th century. And then I think I really don't know, other people may comment on it, but there is this notion that basically, as if jurisprudence, in fact, does what jurisprudence wanted to do, namely determines things in society. So people study Islam as if it is, in fact, the kind of jurisprudential project that jurisprudence wanted to be. So that's what I'm objecting to.
Well, it's very nice for me to have a chance to hear Sonia talk, because many years ago I wrote a paper about the Iranian Revolution, and so I read some of this history from a very different perspective. Thank you for having me drop in this afternoon. I'm sorry that the schedule of the graduate dean doesn't make it possible for me to be any place for whole days anymore, since February is when we visit 55 different PhD programs in 1 month to talk about admissions. What I'm going to do this afternoon, because I'm a social scientist and not coming from many of the same interpretive communities that I know many of you are as scholars of religion or anthropologists or historians. I'm a historical sociologist and political scientist. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the fascinating findings in the book that was mentioned before, What a Mighty Power We Can Be, which is a phrase from an African American women's fraternal ritual. It's a book that I did with a woman, Ariane Liazos, who's now a PhD student, almost getting her PhD in history here at Harvard, and Marshall Gans, who some of you may know is a long-term labor organizer, citizen organizer who teaches at the Kennedy School. I'll talk a little bit about what this project came out of, what kinds of groups we were looking at, and then some of the very surprising and interesting things that we found in the course of the research about the role of women in a set of groups that would appear to be about male brotherhood. It's empirical because that's the kind of social scientist I am, but also historical, and there's a little bit about ritual at the end that I'll mention. For some years, I've been working with various colleagues and students to study the development of voluntary associations in American society and politics. I think it was over a decade ago that some of us set out to try to do something that we thought would be easy, which was to discover, apart from churches and apart from political parties, which are themselves groups that people voluntarily join in American society and democracy, but in addition to those, we set out to discover the associations that had individuals as members that at any point between 1790, when America was launched as a nation, and the present, enrolled 1% or more of American adults. And because so many groups in American history were for men alone or women alone, we relaxed that criteria in one way. We allowed it to be 1% of adult women or 1% of adult men. Now, that project took a long time because there turned out to be 60 such associations that, for at least a brief period or many decades, as the case might be, were over that remarkable threshold. It may not sound like a lot, 1% of American adults, but it's actually a lot of people. And sometimes it was as much as 10 to 12% of the population in a particular group. I think it was in the 1870s that the Independent Order of Good Templars, which was a men's and women's association devoted to temperance reform, and probably a place where young men and women could meet outside of the supervision of their parents in the Saturday night meetings. That group peaked at over 12% of the American population. And then there were farm groups and women's religious groups and male military veterans groups and all kinds of groups. Well, that project culminated in a couple of books that my colleagues and I published, Civic Engagement in American Democracy, and my own book on membership, From Membership to Management. That's the subtitle. And what is the title? It was published some years ago. That's what happens when you're in your 50s. Anyway, in the course of that research, we also paid a little bit of attention to ethnically or racially specific voluntary groups that weren't, of course, anywhere near as large as 1% of the entire adult American population. And if we ran across them, we kind of put them in a separate file. And the file on African American groups, particularly fraternal groups, and here I mean not the kind of groups you might find in a college, a fraternity or a sorority. There are lots of African American fraternities and sororities, actually, but those would be only for college people. Here, instead, I'm talking about groups like the Grand United Order of Oddfellows or the Prince Hall Masons, founded here in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1775, or the Improved Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks of the World, or the United Brothers of Friendship and the Sisters of Mysterious Ten, or the International Order of Knights of Tabor and Daughters of the Tabernacle, or the Mosaic Templars of America, those kinds of groups. We started running across them and started keeping a separate file. Like I say, many of them were much smaller than the cutoff of 1% of the American population, because African Americans were about 10 to 11% of the population. So a group would actually have to be very, very huge among African Americans to make that 1% cutoff for the American population as a whole. At a certain point, as the bigger project was coming to an end, some of us, as actually a group of 6 of us, decided to form a special group to carry through what was just a fun project on the side. This is a case where we got into this just because we were curious and interested. We were running across these African American fraternal groups, some of which we recognized as being parallel to large fraternal groups among white Americans. The Masons, the United Oddfellows, and the Elks would all be in that category. Or the Knights of Columbus is a large white Catholic fraternal group. There's a African American counterpart called the Knights of Peter Claver, much smaller. So we recognized some of them as parallel, and then we recognized that some other ones really didn't seem to have any counterpart among whites, and yet could become very, very large among blacks. So we said to ourselves, okay, we'll take a summer or two and try to track down everything we can find about these African American groups. Now, this is in the context, by the way, of understanding that our group over time had come to understand that fraternal groups, groups that meet in lodges, that enact little morality plays, sometimes from the Bible, sometimes from classical literature, that are secret in the sense that non-members are not supposed to know the ritual, although actually in American history, people do know. And if you remember the old Amos and Andy shows where the women always knew the rituals of the men when they went to their secret lodges, that's typical. It's more that these fraternal groups are self-selecting, secret brotherhoods or sisterhoods that enact morality plays of various kinds, and we'll say a little bit more about that later, and often engage in mutual aid of one kind or another, perhaps providing some kind of insurance before the Social Security Act, and sometimes engage in community projects like raising money for a scholarship to send children to college, or repairing a community institution, or occasionally getting involved in a political campaign for some kind of legislation at the local, state, or national level. Fraternal groups of that sort, we had discovered in our broader research, were about 40% of all the associations that ever became very large in American history. There's something about Americans in the 19th through the middle of the 20th century that made them want to go once a week to lodges, dress up in funny costumes, engage in morality plays and initiation rituals for new members, wear beautiful ribbon badges, and I should have brought a couple of them today because I have a collection of thousands of them from all different associations. March in parades, something about American life that made people want to enact a little bit of royalty or nobility in a much more democratic way because large numbers of Americans of all walks of life, not just business people, not just professionals, but lower white-collar people, factory workers, many agricultural laborers, among blacks, many sharecroppers, were members of these associations, one or more of them. So we knew they were important in American life, and we wanted to see, well, what kinds of groups grew up among African Americans? Did they grow up at the same time? Were they similar to or different from the white groups? And did they play the same kind of role in African American life? You'll have to get the book to get all of our findings, because I want to get to the part about women, but here are some striking things that we found. We found that African Americans created at least their share, probably more than their share, of fraternal associations from 1775 through the middle of the 20th century. Some of them exist to this time. That is, they had as many in relation to their share of the population of fraternal groups that had local lodges, state meetings, and national meetings, and spanned 2 or more states. They had as many in relation to their share of the population as white groups or ethnics who came from Europe and ended up being defined as white Americans eventually. So African Americans were fully part of this particular organizational and cultural form, and there's little evidence that these groups were brought from Africa. There's a lot of evidence that they were created in the United States in ways that directly imitated U.S. forms organizationally and culturally. 2 major types of fraternal groups grew up among African Americans. Groups that resembled very closely white counterparts, which emerged after whites refused to accept African Americans as members. That would be the Prince Hall Masons, founded by some English some Revolutionary wartime soldiers here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, before it spread over much of the United States, chartered from England because the white Masons in the United States would not accept African Americans. Similarly, in the 1840s, the Grand United Order of Oddfellows, black Oddfellows, got their charter from an English branch of Oddfellows when the other branch of Oddfellows that had come from England among whites would not accept blacks as members. So parallel groups are groups that asserted African Americans' rights to partake of a form of ritual and social organization that whites already had but would not share with blacks. The second type, in many ways, is even more interesting. Distinctive African American groups, usually with biblical names, accepting men and women together in the same organization, but with no counterpart among whites. Very similar in organization and in purposes to white and other African American fraternal groups, but distinctive to blacks. They grew up mainly from the Civil War onwards and flourished especially through the middle of the 20th century. So we set out in our research to map these major groups, 7 of each type. We tried to develop a count by looking through old newspapers, old ethnographies, many ethnographies done by white anthropologists in the South in the 1920s and the 1930s, others done by the various researchers who worked for Gunnar Myrdal in the 1940s. W.E.B. Du Bois was a big researcher in this area, St. Clair Drake, some of the great black historians and anthropologists. We went through their works in great detail and wrote down the names of every African American fraternal group we could find that spanned 2 or more states. We came up with 111 of them, and were able to judge that that represented about 11% of all such large fraternal groups among Americans, which means African Americans did their share. We looked in detail at the large parallel groups and distinct groups, and then we started asking some questions about these groups as schools for democracy. What is it about these groups that drew black men and women in, and what kinds of leverage did they offer to black men and women in the larger society? We discovered from looking through old city directories that in many parts of the South and North and Midwest, African American men or women organized more lodges in relation to their size of the population than whites did, that lodges that were open to men and women together were much more common among African Americans. That finding startled us, because I think when we went into the research, we thought, well, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham and others have demonstrated that black women were especially active in society through churches, through Baptist and Methodist churches. What we will find here, we thought, was African American men were active through fraternal groups. African American women were more active disproportionately through churches. That's not what we found. What we found is that in the black fraternal world, women were often attending groups side by side with men, were sometimes able to be the elected leaders of groups that enrolled both men and women together, and that women, if anything, organized more lodges per capita than black men, and certainly far more than black women. So we found that. Than white women. Another thing that we found was that black men's and women's fraternal groups became very active in something quite recognizable as the struggle for equal racial equality from the Civil War period on, very obviously. How did they do that? Well, the simple act of organizing and of maintaining an organization was an act of defiance in many parts of the United States during many of the decades when these groups existed. But more than that, they often used dues to marshal money to engage in lobbying campaigns, struggles against segregation of public facilities, which was imposed in many communities for the first time in the late 19th century after a period following the end of slavery in which there was more integration. So black groups were fighting that. And by the 20th century, lots of evidence that African American fraternal groups such as the Prince Hall Masons, the Improved Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks of the World, and their partner group, the Daughters of the Improved Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks of the World, were raising money to donate to the NAACP so that it could be used for the legal struggles that led into the civil rights breakthroughs of the 50s and 60s. Ariane Liazos and Marshall Guyons did a lot of research in legal records because one of the first major civil rights struggles after the end of slavery and after the struggles accompanying the end of Reconstruction and the reimposition or the imposition of official segregation in many parts of the nation, one of the first big struggles turns out to have been the fight of many African American groups to preserve their right to organize using names and rituals that were similar to white names and rituals. Between 1890 and 1930, some of the major white orders found the simple existence of a counterpart among African Americans, completely segregated, nobody attending the same meetings, so threatening that they went to state governments all over, not just the South, but much of the North, had laws passed that said, for example, the white Elks had laws passed that said the black Elks could no longer use the name Elks or a ritual similar to the white Elks. The white Knights of Pythias had laws passed that said the black Knights of Pythias could not use a similar name or rituals. In the face of that attempt to destroy a form of organization, which during a period when blacks could not join unions, could not vote in many places, was one of the most important forms of social organization side by side with churches, African Americans marshaled their resources through collecting local dues, channeling them into state organizations, and then projecting them into legal battles in key states, which were later appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. Between 1890 and 1930, they waged struggles over the right to organize under certain names for three major fraternal groups, and ultimately won those struggles when the cases were appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. Our research shows that many of the lawyers who pioneered in those early fights over fraternal organization and names went on to work for the NAACP and became the bridge to some of the legal struggles in the mid-20th century that recapitulated the same story, because as blacks learned that they could take things to the federal level and trump things that were happening in the states. In these struggles, not just men's lodges, but women's lodges were very, very active, particularly through the Prince Hall Mason structure, where it would have been the Order of Eastern Star among the black women, and the Daughter Elks, who, as one historian put it, were often more like the Mother Elks to the male Elks. Now I'm going to mention one final part of our study. One part of our group collected the rituals used by men's groups, women's groups, white groups, black groups, and gender-integrated African American groups, and did a careful analysis of the themes that were important in the little morality plays that are enacted in lodges. In fact, our group assembled at my house one night and enacted one of these little morality plays, and we spent quite a little time, since many of us are rather secular, reading through the Bible to figure out which stories were being used in which ritual and to decipher the exact meaning of referring to Rebecca as opposed to Ruth in a fraternal ritual. What we ultimately found is that white men's rituals and some of the black men's rituals that closely paralleled white men's rituals tended to enact stories about individual virtue and the development of individual skill and the establishment of hierarchies of achievement through earning degrees in fraternal lodges. White women's rituals were based around stories of helpmateship. Now, I want to be careful here. There's nothing in this fraternal world that I'm describing as it has flourished from the 19th century through the mid-20th century and even to some degree down to our time that would be particularly advanced in a feminist sense in the modern term. All fraternal groups, black and white, accept some degree of gender differentiation in traditional terms. But the white women's rituals were based around stories of helpmateship. They celebrated women's virtue as helping men and helping families in a private sphere. African American women's rituals were much more likely to do things like use the story of Ruth and Naomi in the Bible to project a picture of women as independent moral agents, in particular among the Daughter Elks, to look at women as a collective force in their own right, working together for charitable purposes, not simply as an extension of or helpmates to men. And finally, the gender-integrated African American fraternal groups, the most interesting in many ways, were the strongest in emphasizing themes of what we call pilgrimage, in which the rituals and the stories were about the formation of a supportive community that together was moving toward Jerusalem or moving toward some goal representing a more charitable or just community. So these are tendencies in the rituals. They're not perfect, but we found some very striking differences that are related to race and gender and the unique capacity of African Americans to bridge gender divides in their form of fraternal organization at a time when that was virtually unheard of in other American voluntary associations. I don't have more time. If I did, I would talk about the fact that African American groups were much more likely to stress internationalism from a very early time. You can tell that in their names. The whites were the Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks. The blacks were the Improved Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks of the world. The whites are the Knights of Pythias. The blacks are the Knights of Pythias of Europe, North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia. And even in empirical fact, as opposed to symbolic aspiration, African American groups were much more likely to bridge outside the borders of the United States into the Caribbean, the northern part of Latin America, and to Liberia in Africa, whereas white groups were usually within the United States itself or maybe into English Canada. And I say were, some of these groups still exist. Certainly the Prince Hall Masons and the Improved Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks of the World still exist. For the most part, this is a world that flourished in America between the time of the Civil War, and particularly with a big burst of organization after African Americans were freed from slavery, and the mid-20th century. But we found it to be a fascinating and surprising world, and one that we argue in the book is very closely connected to some of the most interesting and participatory trends in American democracy, and certainly to the struggle both ideological and legal for the establishment of a more equal understanding of American democracy. So let me stop there. Sure.
For just a few questions, this paper, and then we'll break to a broader conversation.
Yep, I read your book. I think it's a fascinating study, and I don't have a question. I more or less have an observation. What's interesting about your study is if you look at African American religious history during the early 20th century, particularly blacks migrating to the Midwest and the North, you have black women making up some 80% of the church population, but being denied access to the pulpit and leadership roles in the church.
Right.
What's interesting about your study is you're suggesting that in secular civil organizations, black women actually had an opportunity to organize, to get some autonomy that wasn't taking place in the church context. So I think what's interesting about the study gives us a lot to think about in terms of post-religious movements in this early 20th century, thinking about the role of women in African-American religious thought.
Thank you for that observation. Of course, these groups weren't entirely secular because they usually were built around biblical stories, and they had all kinds of resonances with what men and women would have heard in church. But you're right. It's a startling fact, actually, that in the late 19th and early 20th century, you could see entire fraternal federations, in the case of the Independent Order of St. Luke, led by women, where the woman was the top leader. That's Maggie Lena Walker. And there were others that we found. The Imperial Order of King David, I have a badge that I found in an antique store in Virginia that has the picture of the woman who was the head of the order on it. And at the level of local lodges, at the level of state meetings. And we have some nice little charts in the book that show the officers that were recorded in the meetings in states. That gives me an opportunity to say, you might wonder where the data came from this. Well, it came in part from reading those old newspapers and those old anthropological accounts, old official histories from these groups, social histories by historians, but it also came from something that's a lot of fun, which is going around to antique stores and finding old things. In the case of ribbon badges, but also rituals and reports of meetings, because what people do, white and black alike, when there's a convention, a state convention for fraternal groups, which were held every year or every other year in much of American history, it was a big thing for people to do, is they record every single officer and every single meeting that's held over a 5 to 6 day period. So you can go through and count up the men and the women and figure out who's doing what in those sources of evidence. And we found a lot of them on eBay auctions and a lot of them in antique stores, and occasionally in some university libraries, but not very often. Yeah.
Thank you. Why is there such a religious nature to the
Yeah. Well, Oddfellows, first of all, Oddfellows existed in many branches in England from the 1800s on. And like a fair number of these groups, they got their names from some kind of drinking clubs or where people were making jokes, really. Now, Oddfellows existed in many different branches in England, and then some of the branches came to the United States. And in the case of the two major branches that get established in America, one's black and one's white. But the black Oddfellows, to this day, still send a portion of their dues to a white group in England, that is their parent. Now, so the names in some ways come out of this or that. Virtually no distinctive groups among African Americans, that is, ones that were not paralleling these white groups that sometimes came from Europe. The black groups are almost all built around a biblical name or a biblical story. Why? Because that's the kind of literary and moral material people had to work with. And one of the important things for the leaders who would found a new fraternal group, it was just very important to come up with a moral story of some sort around which to build the rituals and to name the virtues that people individually and collectively were aspiring toward. And most of what would be available to African Americans would be either to adapt the ritual from a white group, maybe modifying it. And we find that when they do modify it, it's always by building in more Christian prayers and hymns and stories, or to take a Bible story themselves and build a group around that. There are a few instances in our long list of 111 where it sounds like maybe a story about Africa is there. Not from Africa, I'm quite certain, but the king of Menelik and the princesses of Abyssinia is one group. I've never found a ritual for them, so I don't know what the story is that is being enacted there. But for the most part, people were using the stories available to them. The interesting thing about African American fraternal groups, though, is that they would include Methodists and Baptists in the same group. So they're cross-cutting to some degree. They're not simply an appendage of a church congregation or a church denomination.
I was wondering if these groups, you said they collected dues and that sort of thing, did they often have their own spatial structure and space, or did they rent communal halls?
Oh, I wish I could have brought. I could have brought my PowerPoints. But yeah, I mean, I have a postcard of a lovely little shack, basically, that was the Grand United Order of Oddfellows Lodge in West Virginia mining community. So when they could, and this takes a considerable effort because the members are mostly poor people in these, by definition. Most African Americans were not well-to-do. But if they could pull it together from their dues structures, they would try to create a hall. And that means that some of the communal spaces that were available to African Americans even in southern cities. I mean, there is a magnificent Prince Hall Mason's brick multi-story structure in Birmingham, Alabama. Now, a group like a relatively large and rich group might create a structure, and then it might rent it out to other groups in the community for their ritual night. So these were sometimes shared. That would be true among whites as well as blacks.
Marie? Well, thank you so much for this. I'm riveted by this research, and I haven't read the book, so I want to go right out and read this. But just thinking about, you mentioned earlier in your presentation that this is really empirical, so you've given us all this fascinating stuff. I guess in keeping with the theme here, I'm trying to think about the ways in which women matter in these, African American organizations where there were men and women together. And I was thinking, Professor
Well, first of all, if you ask why, and I didn't talk about that, I do think that the fact that African American women were often breadwinners for their families helps us to understand. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why they probably had a greater presence, either in their own lodges or in integrated lodges or integrated meetings, gender integrated, I mean, not racially. Because these groups, among other things, collected dues and provided some form of burial insurance or maybe sickness insurance, the fact that African American women were important earners for their families meant that it was important for them to be part of that system in that community. I do think that the Protestant Christianity and the fact that in various ways women have probably a little more leverage in Baptist and Methodist settings than they might in some other kinds of religious or church organizations, meant that especially when you could get to a space that was related to but not dominated by the ministers, that women could have a little more role. But what difference did it make? It had to have made a tremendous difference. It meant that in a lot of meetings, men and women were officers together. I mean, these are what are one historian called elaborately officered organizations. I mean, the main thing about white and black fraternal lodges is that they take about 10 to 12 officers for each lodge. And that's not counting the officers you got to have for the state convention and the national convention, and because they're the chief people, and then they're the deputies, and there's the secretary and the treasurer and the guards on the doors, and the person in charge of the rituals. And the fact that women had so many lodges among African Americans, either side by side or they were part of the same, meant that they had many opportunities to be elected or appointed as leaders. And many African Americans would have had the experience in being in groups that sometimes the black press commented snidely on them, that they were female dominated. There was resentment sometimes. I don't want to portray this as all sweetness and light. But it does mean that African American women were getting a lot of opportunities to be leaders in their own right, to a pretty unusual degree, including in gender integrated situations. Before that would have been true for many white women. And it means that African American men, to their chagrin to some degree, had to deal with women who were, if not quite their equals, then certainly a big organizational presence alongside them.
Carol, did you?
Hi. Thank you so much to both of you for wonderful papers. This question is directed towards Professor Scotchfall. How did class figure into the membership of these organizations?
That's a good question.
Were working class and professional class black men and women together in the same lodge, or were they segregated by class?
No, they weren't segregated by class. I mean, part of the reason that fraternal groups are so fascinating, and once again, distinguishing them from sororities and fraternities in colleges, is that they are class-integrated groups. And especially among African Americans, individual lodges, let alone entire federations, would have a massive presence of blue-collar people. The evidence for this is imperfect because we don't everywhere have membership lists that have occupations, but we've pulled together a lot of evidence, both from the work that some African American social historians have done, the wonderful book on Worcester, Massachusetts, Amos Weber. I'm trying to remember what the name of that book is. Looks at the Black Oddfellows, and he does have membership lists. And people were attending the same lodges from business background, professional background, kind of white-collar occupations, and then laboring backgrounds. The laborers would be in the vast majority, and the ideology of these groups almost always had places in the rituals that emphasized that to be a good member was not the same thing as to be simply an educated person or a rich person. Now, critical-minded types will say, well, yeah, but they had a middle-class ideology. If by middle-class ideology we mean that they emphasized personal virtue, following the law, behaving respectably, absolutely, they did. But they were not middle-class in composition, and they actually were remarkable in bridging across occupational and class groups, and always among whites and blacks alike, but especially among blacks given the reality of the black population, they celebrated that fact, that brotherhood and sisterhood was not simply a matter of tying people together in a particular class.
Would you like to sit down?
Yep, I would.
We're not going to end the discussion by any means, but I thought we'd let Professor Scotchpole sit down.
And I think there are some interesting ties between the stories that we told.
More comments, other questions, comments? Yeah.
I had a question putting Professor Scotchpole's presentation.
Just call me Theta. You know.
Up again, I call her Janet too. For the presentation of the idea of Mary Douglas's theme of the desire for order on a disordered world, and Janet talked about the third category of the gender that couldn't be assimilated to male or female. And I learned in your research you came across any sort of example of anomalous individuals who couldn't be classed according to one race or black or white, couldn't be classed according to male or female, or either because of mental illness or immigrant status or class, somehow transcending those quadrants.
You know, I don't think these groups were very much into thinking about transgender categories. I mean, they were pretty clear about gender roles. But the idea that this was an attempt to create some kind of an order with moral principles separate from the mundane world that people had to leave when they entered the lodges, very, very important. Because the assertion of principles of moral equality, of moral worth, of the ability to be elected to office, a whole series of things were assertions of kind of religious and American citizen conceptions of equality that were exactly the opposite from what African Americans were experiencing the minute they stepped out the door. And these groups were used both to assert very conservative moral principles, and I think this is where there's a little bit of similarity to some of what Afsanya was talking about, and to make a radical statement. And probably nowhere more than, say, in a southern community where, at the depth of segregation in the deep South in America, blacks were not allowed to organize and assemble in public. I mean, it was really, you could go to church, and you could go into these lodges, but one thing that these lodges would do was engage in funeral rituals, funeral marches. So when somebody died, they'd dress up in their costumes and wear their badges, men and women alike, and march in public. So it was both a very conservative statement, and whites usually, when they weren't trying to destroy these groups legally, would usually sort of accept it because it was a source that they it was a form they understood. But it was also, it was very conservative principles being espoused. At the same time, it was an act of radicalism to appear in public in that kind of march. So I don't think it's that unusual, actually, to see conservatism. You were saying, does this happen in other places? I think it does. I mean, in my book, Protecting Soldiers and Mothers, a lot of American women were using very conservative ideas about women's essence and women's moral worth as a basis for getting leverage that was anything but conservatives. And sometimes people with different partisan political views would come together in those efforts. If we look at Latin America and we see the form of the grieving mother used as a way to assert kind of a claim against a dictatorship that kills people, that's a conservative form being used for purposes that could be quite challenging to an existing order, and it might bring together people of different specific political views. So I don't think it's that unusual. I think it happens in different ways in different traditions in different times and places, but very much going on.
What was the relationship between the lodges and the churches?
They coexisted very closely in the same communities. People definitely belonged to both. Sometimes lodges held ceremonies in churches, for example, for Emancipation Day. But it's also the case that people who might go to different congregations on Sunday, and if you go and look at city directories, there are lots and lots of black congregations. They're all Baptist or Methodist, but there's a lot of different varieties of them. People who went to different congregations on Sunday could belong to the same lodge. So to some degree, they cross-cut.
Yes, did you have
this whole time I've been sitting here sort of trying to figure out what motivation the officers would have had in the first place just for letting women in. And I'm wondering, as you're speaking, if somehow the fact that women were there made the group seem obviously less threatening to a white community, if that might...
I don't think...
well, I'm just curious about why do you think they were open to this in the first place?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, there's a black historian who wrote about white and black elks. It's a very interesting book, and he makes the comment that, which is very true, that the white elks in America never allowed the growth of a powerful women's auxiliary. And he says that the black male elks felt pretty much the same way about women. But the black women were just more assertive. They simply organized their own daughter elks. And I think it has to do with the greater economic necessity and leverage of black women, that they could assert themselves in these ways and not simply be told no. Remember, this is a whole series of decades in American history where whites of the upper blue-collar strata and higher were more able to realize the cultural ideal of the man going to work and the woman staying home. The same cultural ideal might very well have been held, and I think it was, by a lot of African Americans, but they were too poor to realize that ideal. And the occupational openings for black men were so constricted that women had to go to work, often as domestics, sometimes as social workers, teachers. That simply gave them more leverage, more skills, more ability to say we're important in the family and in the community. So I think it's not so much that the men didn't want to dominate the women or exclude them. It's just that they couldn't do it, and the women took their opportunities where they saw them, and they organized.
I'm sort of thinking, if I could just speak for myself, a lot of the work that I do is on issues about orthodoxy and heresy. You know, who and how claims to authority are made, how exclusions are made. And it seems to me that one of the things that we've been touching on in various kinds of ways are issues about the way in which religious language, religious narrative, religious stories, sources, vocabulary, and so forth can be used and displaced from what would be, major sites of religious authorization, like, you have to be a minister to speak in a church, et cetera, or the ways in which, activist women, are gathering together, and there's an intersection then of the use of religious language, story, and so forth, in ways that disrupt or redefine or use gender to do different kinds of political, but sort of off-site. And the way that in which if we understand religion too often in terms of the authorizing discourses around it, that we miss what's going on precisely at the intersection of religion and gender. And I'm thinking in particular about the, poetry, as a site, where the intersection of religious language in a way is used for multiple kinds of work. And if people would like to comment or are interested in commenting on that. Sarah, would you like something? Yeah.
I want to be sort of counter-suggestive and take issue, not with the content of what you say, but the way, this whole notion of use of religious idiom. I find this problematic. think because it assumes a sort of utilitarian attitude towards religion that I think at least the people I've known and come to work with in Iran actually resent deeply. And one of them, in one recent meeting that I was at a Society of Women Historians, where I have always get tongue-tied when I'm trying to categorize people, and I don't want to do it. But it was a session in which a secular political scientist was giving a talk about history of women's movement, and of course she at the end came to discuss about the secular groups and religious groups and talked about how religious women are reinterpreting the Quran and this or that. And one woman from the audience, when it came to discussion, got up and said, look, you guys, you secularists, think I, as a Muslim woman, read the Quran and I don't like its meaning, and then I go and think, how am I going to change this meaning and give new meaning with it? That's not how it works. I read this and I understand it as an egalitarian book. My problem is try to understand why other people don't understand it the way I understand. So I'm trying to say that a lot of the people who are using religious idiom don't think of it as using an idiom. That seems to be, that's what constitutes meaning for them as such. So I don't know. I'm just trying to be argumentative.
Could I just suggest a way to put these two perspectives together? I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think people read religious traditions, texts, performances, and they see different possibilities in them. And why not? I mean, you can read the Bible and see very different stories that suggest different degrees of empowerment or authorization for women, it seems to me. But the point that there may need to be an institutional space or an organizational space that's a little bit separate from, I think, what I feel we saw in this world is common religious idioms interpreted in various ways by different actors, but it seems that it was easier for the women or for the gender integrated groups to make to understand and to articulate some of the egalitarian possibilities along gender lines. It was easier for them to do that in some of the fraternal lodges than it was in the church congregations themselves. So the separation might be by group, not by ideas. And I don't think it would be right to suggest that people were sitting there and saying, I'm a modern feminist, how can I use this for these purposes? Not at all.
Yeah, and that would be certainly not what I intended. But the sort of work, the context when I'm in, it's the claim about revision that works as you're rewriting it, you're retelling it. Here's the real truth. And they're trying to stabilize it in terms of an essentialist meaning that actually fits a particular kind of political program. And then the claim that you're reinterpreting, you're rewriting, there's a revisionist mode. That's where the sort of orthodox discourse piece sort of slides into play. And there are lots of people who want in on this conversation. Janet and I think Sandra. I'm sorry, Stephanie Sandler. Yes. Do you want to start us off? And
sure. I had been about to say something very similar to what you said, because in listening to the discussion of these fraternal orders, I was thinking about what little I know about the Masons of the American South right now, and thinking about the kind of people who are in effect doing something like religious practice, but by other means. And as I was thinking about your comment back to that, Asani, I was thinking about the difference in the way people inhabit their religious identities. For whatever reason, I don't think it differentiates by religion. A kind of discomfort or ironic relationship or whatever, you may still seek venues to have that kind of experience, to reenact those texts, the kinds of dramas that you were talking about, which I think is fascinating as we think about the kinds of work to be done or the kinds of sites to study religion and gender. It seems to me that's one of the things that's being described here, not the traditional.
And also, it's an interesting question about intentionality and instrumentality, but we needn't get hung up on it because you could easily give an account in which it's not as though this is articulated deliberately or not, but it's what happens. And maybe it's what I would want to do also is bring it back to, I guess, the kind of thing that I was trying to talk about in my presentation about a certain place, and many feminist theories have argued it as well, where women and other displaced groups are often already in the margins and are sort of comfortable in the margins and also are comfortable with a multiplicity of kinds of interpretations. And whether they're doing it on purpose or not, it's kind of what they end up doing. And one thing I just wanted to make reference to Carol's presentation that links up with Afsana's, which I was very struck with, is another site that we see such stuff happening is in the material culture. In your presentation, Afsana, I love the stuff about when women are dealing with, say, the issue of the veil, again, whether it's intentional or not, and where you see this kind of creeping. It's not a question of whether you wear the veil or not, but given the fact that you have this outfit, what happens when you just change it ever so slightly? And then the nuance and the possibilities of it, and the way they kind of inching over, and maybe, the way you put it was great, that on occasion they may, or where they're wearing, like an outfit that looks almost like it, but it's just that it isn't. For me at least, that's a really productive and almost like a genius place where people who are already used to splitting the difference, it ends up, being actually in some ways a very politically efficacious thing that can be done.
I wanted to add something, Richard, that the veiling and the mammy kind of dress, that in both cases you have the same visual attributes that define the female body as a site of oppression, as a site that stereotypes the Muslim woman or the mammy. But then these women use it as an affirmation of their identity, and they, I think Ahmed has a wonderful chapter on the discourse of the veil, where she deals with the ambivalence of it as a site of oppression by colonialists who see it as Islam as a negative thing, and then how women, feminists, Islamic women, take it as a sign of their identity and their right to affirm it, but also as a sign of ambivalence. And I think that that's also something that we saw here, the same stereotype of Jemima being used as a kind of affirmation, an empowering affirmation of identity.
Reminds me of some work we were doing on the way that in Roman society, the head is a homonym for the sexual organ. And so what you do with what you wear or don't wear on your head, whether you veil or don't veil, what kind of veil, how far the veil goes back, how you style your hair, and so forth, are all, very carefully monitored signals, social signals about status and sexual availability and whether one is a mother or not, and so on and so forth. So all that great statuary with all those incredibly complex braided hairs or veils or not veils and who's vetting, is a very coded system that they're very explicit is about, female sexual organs, but that's another topic. Yes, right. Other questions? Anne? Oh, you're just shifting. Okay. Okay, don't move. Yes, it is. It is. Yes. So we've just got a few minutes left before we want to take a break. Yes.
If I can follow up with Theda on the previous question about architecture, but also bringing up with the Masons. I mean, the Masons, as we know, are very explicit about their tradition back to the Solomonic.
And it isn't actually a Christian ritual at its origins. It's at its core.
Yeah. But what interests me is they have an architectural space that's very closed off to outsiders and often built on a Solomonic temple model and the way they measure it in an inner sanctum and that sort of thing. So I was wondering, again, in the black counterparts, if any of these spaces that are not church spaces are also considered at sometimes at points sacred space.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. And we have in the book out of one of the rituals, we have a diagram of a subordinate temple for the daughter elves, and it's definitely a space. Once the meeting starts, there's a certain kind of a consecration process and a barrier created to the outside. And the interesting thing, if you look at this diagram, is there's a whole series of offices, including being a chaplain and a daughter ruler, that would be open to women that would not be in a lot of other settings. But aside from that, fraternalism in American fraternalism, and actually this exists in Europe in part too, it's pretty standardized actually that the rituals are created, are enacted in a lodge room that once the process starts is in some sense sacred space separate from the outside. I mean, I'm a member of the Grange, which is a gender integrated white group, and yeah, we close the door and there's a guard and we have a Bible and a flag and go through a whole thing. It's definitely consecrated space, and it is very similar. I guess it's different and similar. It's similar to churches, and it's different in that the closing off to the outside is an important part of it. So you have to have a room. You do have to have a room. You either have to own it or rent it.
Julie, you want the last?
Have you done any work looking into the origins of these fraternal orders in Europe and sort of how they arise in Europe? And are there relationships between understandings or misunderstandings coming from other cultures? Sort of.
I've done a little of that. I mean, a lot of this comes out of kind of England and Scotland, really. I don't really believe that these groups, how to put this, they sort of carry over into the New World, but something very different happens when they get to the United States. For one thing, almost all American fraternal orders, whether they be by whites who came from England or Scotland or Ireland, bringing a variant of a group here, or whether they be Czech Americans. You know, I'm married to a Czech American, so we looked into the Czech American ones, or whether they be African American, whatever they are, they all end up with a structure that parallels the structure of the American Constitution, with local units, state units, and national units, and a way of electing officers and stuff that has resemblances to the American constitutional order. Whereas in the old country, they may be structured differently that parallels the states in those societies. So there are both institutionalist and cultural things that you need to look at. And sure, there are carryovers, especially with the cultural things. But something different happens in the United States, and all the different groups that are busy hating and excluding each other are imitating each other very closely in the institutional orders, the structures of officers that they elect, the virtues that they celebrate, with some differences, and I pointed to some today around gender, that are quite interesting among African Americans.
Well, I think we'll take a break now after that and thank our presenters.